Okay, fantastic. We will kick off, and thank you so much, Jamie. I am really, really excited to be here to launch the Mindfulness Initiative's latest report, Developing Agency in Urgent Times. It's genuinely a fascinating, thought-provoking, insightful read. I found myself over the weekend quoting it to all my friends and saying, not only does it give you advice on marital relations, it also gives you insights on climate change. So what more you could possibly want from a document, I don't know. Myself, I am Katie White. I am chair of the Mindfulness Initiative. And tonight I will be introducing our panel and they will go through the document, and then we'll have a chance to ask questions. So the Mindfulness Initiative is a charity that was established in 2013 to support the APPG on mindfulness within the UK Parliament. We are associated with the 4 mindfulness training centres in the UK: Bangor, Exeter, Oxford and Sussex. And we support mindfulness and compassion in political culture. And we're trying to look at how we can ensure, enrich and thrive that in order that it can affect policymaking in the most positive way. So tonight we are joined by our director, Jamie Bristow, by Rosie Bristow, and by Dan Nixon. And Jamie has been the director since 2015. He is a mindfulness trainer and has an insight trainer in training. And he has been with insight trainer in training. Rosie has been involved in the project. She's a freelance writer. She's been involved in the Mindfulness Initiative for a long time. Her and Jamie are officially thinking partners. They are also life partners at the same time. This is genuinely their baby. This has come out together. And Dan Nixon is a collaborator. He's led research on the mindful economy, coming from 10 years at the Bank of England, but he's been involved with the Mindfulness Initiative in various different research aspects, but we'll be able to field specific questions around this. So I'm going to hand over to Jamie and to Rosie. Dan will be on hand if there's any other additions, and then we'll come to the questions. I'm really looking forward to that bit as well. But so over to you, Jamie.
Thank you so much, Katie. Yeah, and so just a point of order there. This is Rosie Bell rather than Rosie Bristow for those of you who don't know us. So yeah, we're not flouting the COVID-19 restrictions on social distancing. We are very accustomed to being this proximity to each other, and it's been a great pleasure to use lockdown to get this piece of work out finally. So I'm joined by our colleague Dan, and the 3 of us have been working on this it's been in gestation for years. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the background to why we started thinking about this. But this, so we've got the publication that we've launched today, and so there's sort of 3 bottom-up rewrites. As we tried to find the right framing for what we were trying to do, which is flesh out a narrative for understanding mindfulness as a foundational proposition to meet the challenges of our current historic moment. But first, I'm going to share a few slides with you. So as Katie mentioned, we've been working with politicians in the British Parliament since 2013. So they have had a training program for parliamentarians. Katie, is my screen sharing okay there?
It's looking okay, but if you go to full, that's better. Thanks, Jamie.
All right, great. So yeah, there's been a mindfulness training program in the British Parliament since 2013. And we were the Mindfulness Initiative that I now run was initially a group of advocates and experts and volunteers that came together to help politicians to form an all-party parliamentary group on mindfulness and to inquire into the potential for mindfulness training in different areas of public life. And in 2015, we pulled together the findings of a 12-month inquiry, particularly looking at mindfulness in education, healthcare, criminal justice, and the workplace, into a policy report called Mindful Nation UK. And that was supposed to, it was really needed to be cleared and costed and a kind of like as robust as possible. So we tried to make it about evidence-based change based on evidence that was properly peer reviewed, and like I say, had sort of numbers attached to it, and it was really quite kind of targeted as to we need this many mindfulness teachers to treat this many people who are at risk of recurrent depression. But at the same time, we've had some of the politicians involved wanted to take a more visionary approach. Even back then, they wanted to talk about how the insights from their own practice and how it was helping them to lead better lives in their personal lives and in their professional lives. There could be something bigger and a grander narrative that they could talk about as policymakers. But it was really felt that we needed to stick close to the evidence and the kind of the concrete policy recommendations. But over the last few years, the conversation developed, and it became clear through a number of events we've had, like we had one on mindfulness and social change, and many meetings with parliamentarians. Beyond the headline benefits that you normally hear about in the kind of siloed and kind of fractured disciplines of evidence building and a kind of in an academic scientific discipline, there was something which they wanted to articulate. And an example here, Lord Alan Howarth, a former government minister and an officer of the all-party parliamentary group, talking about how mindfulness was really helpful for his sense of perspective and proportion and balance, how it helped him as a decision maker, as a sense maker in society, in charge of creating and reviewing policy, that this was playing an important role for him. And another politician here, a Dutch member of parliament and a political party leader, saying that mindfulness for her helped her to stay in touch with what was most important with for her own values. And here, the conservative co-chair of the all-party group, talking about mindfulness helps him and his colleagues who have been on a mindfulness course to have a more considered approach to exchanges of differing views. And so, partly through our work with politicians, but also really, working out there in the field and working with all kinds of mindfulness champions and change makers, you got the sense that what they were in it for was something quite profound, quite sort of visionary, but didn't really have the language to sort of land it. And so, I felt there was a role bridging the gap between the kind of more functional evidence base and the more visionary statements that you might be familiar with from like lead trainers. So for instance, the evidence for mindfulness training, nascent in many areas though it is pointing to improved attention, working memory, different aspects of emotional intelligence, reducing stress, anxiety, risk of depression. But when you really probe about why champions of mindfulness are so often evangelistic about it, which can be a double-edged sword, because evangelists I know are deeply it can be deeply annoying. And you get statements a little bit like those which John Kabat-Zinn is well known for. This from his recent paper, a foreword to a collection of mindfulness academic papers in a big journal. And he said, mindfulness is going to help us have a global renaissance catalyzed by the cultivation of mindfulness and heartfulness. So on the one hand, this is, and in the middle, you do have some stuff that's trying to bridge the gap, that's kind of synthesizing these different strands, particularly the kind of work around mindful leadership, which often pulls in cognitive flexibility here and attention there into a kind of broader construct, and looking at, again, sort of multi-dimensional things like pro-sociality and the impact on sustainability, and the more emerging movement towards considering social mindfulness, how mindfulness impacts groups and collective structures, and actually needs to consider those when in training. However, these are still quite small areas, and the synthesis that they've created is not not all that well known, and not necessarily that widely encompassing of all aspects. So the problem with this, we sort of picked up on back then, 2015, 2016, as highlighted by some critics of the mindfulness field, is that when you talk about the detailed stuff, the science, it's sort of dismissed as being a weak balm of self-improvement, and sort of trivial, or what's that really going to do for us at a societal level with the crises that we're facing. But then when we talk about global renaissance catalyzed by the cultivation of mindfulness and heartfulness, it's instead perhaps dismissed as magical thinking. And is there something that we can pull together in the middle to bridge that gap? And it's not exactly the same here, but I'm reminded by this quote from Roberto Unger, the political theorist, who said that if he proposes something that is distant from what exists today, the global Renaissance view, people say that it's very interesting, but it's utopian, or it's in La La Land. But if I propose something that exists that's close, propose something that's close to something that exists, they say it's feasible, but it's trivial, and that results from a misunderstanding of the nature of transformation. So here again, I think we're trying to get a kind of programmatic developmental view, which is what Roberto proposes is necessary, a programmatic view where you kind of stitch together some of these more sort of near-term benefits, like I'll do this course, and in 8 weeks I'll have a slightly better attention regulation. You stitch them together into a programmatic view, which then gets you to a more utopian or visionary place. And unless we acknowledge that sort of developmental paradigm, then we end up sort of dismissing one or the other. So this left us trying to think about what is the biggest picture here? Like, what if mindfulness is doing something more profound than just helping us to focus or be more resilient to depression? What's the most pertinent why? And we went through a number of different formulations. I think Rosie's going to mention one or two of them, to do with sort of, well, living on purpose was one phrase that we had a lot of, the intentionality that mindfulness brings to life. And another one was sort of tuning into values. But we have now found ourselves to something which I will come back to in a big reveal. After I pass over to Rosie. So what we're going to do now is in the next 20 minutes or so, before opening up to questions, I might have to introduce you to this member of the team.
My emotional support animal has arrived.
Is that we're going to look at the formulation we've created, and then sort of go back and forth between the kind of problem statement and why we have issues with that need to be addressed, and then I'll come in with the kind of the mindfulness theory and evidence as to why that might help to address these issues. Okay, there we go.
This is the point at which the person who's an experienced public speaker stops speaking and I begin speaking. And the disclaimer is that I've been allowed to offer you is that this is my first webinar. and I find it all quite alarming. So my natural habitat is in the written word, and so yeah, explaining people things, mouth, brain, isn't traditionally my thing. So I joined this project when we were still trying to articulate what it was, this foundational quality that mindfulness had. And by the time the first draft, I think, was finished, it was called Living on Purpose, and we were coalescing around this idea that mindfulness helps us to be intentional in what we do. And that led through the various reformulations to this idea of its interaction with agency, capacity for intentional action. And we wanted this to be an account of how mindfulness can help us to do what we need to do, and critically how it can help us to do something together about the problems that we're causing together. So we ended up with a model of agency based on sort of three very much interconnected faculties. Like, we've taken them separately for the purposes of explanation, but obviously we never want you to think about these things as being separate, and that's not what we're trying to describe. But for agency to be effective agency, it takes place in a context, and then it's not just a force exerted on the world. It's more of an exchange where we actually take in information from that context, and we do operations on it. We make sense of it. We understand it, and then hopefully we use that understanding to decide what it is that we want to do, and then do it. And we kind of assume that that's how life goes, and that's what we're doing most of the time. We go around the world collecting information, we figure it out, and then we decide and we act. But looking closely at all of these three dimensions of agency, it tends to turn out that for one reason or another, within our own nature and within our cultural environment, that all of these dimensions of agency are actually compromised in various ways, and all of these problems combine to limit our agency. And I think it's important to say at this point that yeah, there are a lot of things that can limit our agency, and some of them are completely outside of our control and outside of the sphere of us. And we're not about to announce that mindfulness can help us to that simply by being mindful, all of the forces that limit our agency will simply disappear. But this is about the internal dimension of those limitations on agency. So I guess I'll just launch into chapter 1. Is that how it should go?
Go chapter by chapter.
Yeah. So that I don't just have a huge breakdown. Cool. So the first dimension that we talk about is perception, is gathering information from the world, which we can understand how, if we want to be effective agents in the world, that we need to perceive effectively. And the underpinning attention, no, gave the game away there. The underpinning perception, of course, is our faculty of attention, and specifically our capacity to attend to what matters. So there are, we all know about the problems that we have with our attention, particularly if we're into mindfulness, but it's very easily distracted, whatever kind of world we're living in. But increasingly, we're now subject to the forces of an extremely powerful attention economy, which Dan may tell you more about later, but very potent market forces that use the technology that we willingly invite into our lives to capture and to sell our attention, and to use it for purposes that are often very much not aligned with our own best interests and with our agency. Another problem that well, not necessarily a problem for perception, is just kind of the way it works. But we typically assume again that we're taking in reality, but often actually we're operating based on cognitive shortcuts. So we predict the world based on existing assumptions and biases and judgments. And obviously this is an adaptive and essential quality that we're not suggesting that we need to abolish in any way, but rather that it's just very very important to be aware of all of these things in the context of agency, and of perceiving what's actually going on as opposed to what we already think. Thirdly, and yeah, very real for me right now, is the concept of overwhelm and information overload. The idea that you know, as we're all experiencing to some degree in a complex world of rapid change, the deluge of information that's coming at us at all times can overwhelm our attention, can overwhelm our capacity to control it, and mean that that we simply can't choose the bits of it that we need in order to function and be effective agents. And among many responses to that is simply shutting down. And it's just one of the things that can shut us down. And another that is probably worth mentioning is cognitive discomfort, things like cognitive dissonance that arise particularly in relation to just having a little melt when new information contradicts our ideas. So in the context of the problems that we need to solve, and the quite big problems that we need to solve, the ways in which our current lifestyle are untenable can make us so uncomfortable that that we're not interested. Yeah, so these are that's a flavor of what perception's up against in our current climate. And yeah, over to Jamie to tell you what we're going to do about it.
Thanks, Rosie, that was great.
So yes, in its most basic formulation, mindfulness practice is a training of the attention. So we are learning to flex and train the muscle of the mind to be where we want it more of the time. And as such, the evidence points towards mindfulness training helping us to resist distracting stimuli and to improve executive control, which is sort of a psychologist's phrase for self-control, which is important for all types of sort of reasoning and behavior regulation. And there's some evidence that it also helps, mindfulness also helps us to be to consume social media less passively, and to perhaps not engage with it in the first place in the way that we would normally do. And so just simply being aware of our patterns of attention, how it shapes our mind, the contents of our mind, and renders our world for us, and how our attention in the way that Rosie described, the kind of the legacy of evolution within us, and how that kind of serves us and also wrongfoots us at different times. Learning those patterns and learning to have that executive control over our minds is always, I think, been a useful facility, a capacity. But in the context of the attention economy, where there are algorithms now running without human control, learning, what most distracts us, what most will bait our emotional systems, our attentional systems, and then sort of capturing and either manipulating or selling us to the highest bidder. These kind of this form of mind training is nothing less than self-defense, or even emancipation, if you put it in a political frame. Emancipation from powers and agendas that are not our own, which could pick us up and draw us who knows where. And Tristan Harris, who a former Google design ethicist and now founder of the Center for Humane Technologies, says if you're not aware of your mind and your body when you're using these technologies, then you've already lost. And so Rosie mentioned sort of cognitive biases and various other evolutionary mechanisms which are helpful at times and not at others. and so similarly, you know, although there are distracting stimuli outside of us, there are also things we can be hijacked from the inside that have perhaps been with us for longer than Facebook. You know, our tendency towards automation and mind wandering, which are, you know, cause unhappiness, but also have a serious impact on the fabric of our relationships, and perhaps most seriously felt in sort of alienation from others, and from the social groups and communities that would form a kind of structure for agency and organizing, but are less so. And we point to evidence about sort of smartphones reducing presence in relationships and satisfaction in relationships, etc. So I've spoken quite a lot there about attention training because it's such a fundamental thing. Some of this other evidence I'm going to skip over quite quickly. There's another element in perception which is important for our intentional action, and that is increasing our receptivity. So this is being more open to, aware of, and accepting of novel information, particularly things that might challenge our pre-existing ideas. So mindfulness training crucially isn't just attention. You know, I would guess most people on this webinar now would be familiar with that. It's awareness of a particular flavor, and that is awareness that is open, allowing, curious, and kind. And in the document, we go into each of those different aspects, but together they kind of upregulate each other, and they hold wide the bandwidth of perception, so that we another phrase that's often used is like beginner's mind. So we're always sort of sensitive to what is new and novel, and some scientists like Ellen Langer go as far as defining mindfulness in terms of novel information. So we are solutions will emerge from the peripheries, from things that we don't already know, but we don't readily accept that fact when we're looking for solutions. And so that's we talk in the paper about how allowing and the much misunderstood phrase like non-judgmental are really sort of functional aspects that help us to be more sensitive to the world, and aren't about sort of accepting the status quo or never changing anything, but helping us being more receptive to what we need to see, and having that rich data. And one of those domains that is most important is the domain of the body. Mindfulness is an embodied practice, and you know, in the early weeks, that's one of the main things that we're doing. We're connecting with the body, increasing our receptivity to the rich source of signal that is there. Signals which tell us things about relationship, that tell us things about our emotions, but also, as we'll come on to talk about a little bit more, our sense of what's most important, our values, and it becomes a kind of a new way of sensing and understanding the world, and getting information from the world. And as such, you know, this sort of openness is one of the things that kind of counteracts the biases. So we step more out of the kind of automatic interpretations, look more at the kind of primary data, if you like, to use that sort of computerized phrase, in order to see things, you know, more how they are. And finally, mindfulness helps us with cognitive resilience. So this is sort of, it underpins, or shores up working memory in the face of chronic stresses like information overload in our current current cultural conditions. So yeah, I'll skip over that one. But for instance, you know, stress, we often talk about it in the workplace, but it really, you know, there's evidence that it undermines activism and campaigning and all kinds of positive things, and leads to perceptual narrowing. So both literally, as in you don't see things in your peripheral vision, and metaphorically, you don't see things outside of what you're expecting. Stress narrows your vision, whereas mindfulness, we propose, opens the bandwidth of perception. therefore giving us the rich data that we need in order to understand the world better and to act on that understanding, which is what Rosie's going to lead us on to now.
Thank you very much. So back to you and your problems. So our next dimension of agency is understanding. So we hopefully receive information from the world, and next we understand it, make sense of it, operate on it with our brains in order to produce knowledge. We do it ourselves, we do it together in the relational space, and we've got a situation, many situations in the world at the moment that require really a quantum leap in our understanding. However, we find that actually, once again, it's undermined by just a myriad of factors. Not to sound too gloomy, we're going to cheer you right back up in a minute. But yeah, among these factors are a generalized sort of declining faith in public institutions. People are beginning to talk about a broken information ecology, which I just think is such an important idea. Broken or polluted information ecology, which is kind of the common ground upon which we exchange ideas and negotiate truth between ourselves, and which like any ecosystem is quite a delicate balance, and is increasingly and deliberately polluted by misinformation. And this kind of contributes to this sort of insidious notion of post-truth, and this being a post-truth era, which in turn sort of allows malign forces to convince people that that their truth is as relevant as any other truth. And we're noticing its effects on democracy and just on people's ability to kind of to operate what they think of as facts in the way that that they need to in order to get anything done, essentially. We're also increasingly polarized. It's a word that we hear with greater frequency every day, and I think polarization can mean that we almost abandon the project of understanding the world and each other in favor of kind of a tighter and tighter sort of lockdown on ideologies that we simply sort of wield against each other. And so rather than working together in any meaningful way to solve complex problems, we tend to try to win against each other. And at all levels, that can just mean that political discourse descends into a bit of a bun fight, and what the enormous resource that we all have to be intelligent together in order to face what we're facing, understand and decide together, is being wasted on an acrimonious exchange a lot of the time, and it also drastically oversimplifies the complex problems that we need to solve. And so social media plays into these dynamics and profits from them and entrenches them ever further in our lives. And yeah, so there's that. Finally, and again, I'm skipping over, I mean, this section contains a lot of complex things that you could probably ping back in with if there is anything that you think that's really important that I've missed. But one thing that's really interesting that feels quite important to mention is the way that people are beginning to look at ways in which our actual fundamental worldview, that's too distracting.
Sorry. Trying to find a slide there.
People are actually starting to talk about ways in which our fundamental worldview as a critical component of understanding just isn't serving us and the complexity of the world that we live in and the problems that we're trying to solve. And indeed, the kind of, theorists talk a lot about the meta-crisis, which isn't just the web of interconnected, inter-influencing crises that we're currently facing, but actually the underlying factors driving all of those crises. And we're encouraged to notice that really these crises have an inner dimension that is to do with the way that we model the world, the way that we actually grasp it, and that we're not actually looking at bedrock fundamental reality, but that grasping of the world that guides all of our cultural choices is actually a framework that is not the only framework, and actually this framework really isn't serving our best interests, and in fact has led us to where we are today with a lot of the difficulties that we're experiencing on a global scale. Let's turn the page, but no, I think that's it. Good news, everyone. We've only got 3 problems.
So where does mindfulness come in the context of this this situation just described? Well, we break this second dimension of agency understanding into 4 main subsections. First is called 2 modes of mind, integrating 2 modes of mind. And this draws heavily upon the work of John Teasdale, who along with his colleagues Mark Williams and Zindel Stiegel developed mindfulness-based cognitive therapy for depression, which is amongst the sort of most robustly evidenced and implemented mental health interventions using mindfulness practice. And John, a kind of very respected cognitive scientist, long before he was known for his mindfulness work, describes how the mindfulness theory is underpinned by mindfulness theory is underpinned by this two modes of mind idea. So some sort of psychiatrists and neuroscientists talk about left and right brain, but it's which is sort of open to much debate. But certainly talking about 2 modes of mind is much more accepted and sufficient. So one and these modes of mind to some extent inhibit each other, but as we'll describe, they can be integrated in a more or less skillful way. So these 2 modes of mind are the holistic intuitive mode and the verbal conceptual mode. So the holistic intuitive mode, which is your kind of parallel processing, wide open, connected to real-time sense data, sometimes associated with the right hemisphere, for those of you who are into that. It's kind of primarily interested in relatedness of the whole system, and is kind of a fuzzy logic, kind of felt sense kind of part of us. It is sort of subjectively, it feels more spacious when we're in that mode. It seems to be upregulated or stimulated by being in nature, whereas dealing with things, man-made things, tends to give us our other mode of mind. So our other mode of mind, verbal conceptual mode, is some researchers think more dominant in the West than it is in the global East, and potentially much more dominant over time, because we created a world with our left hemispheres, with all the technology we've got, and then the technology stimulates our verbal conceptual mode, and it becomes sort of, in the word of one thinker, Ian McGilchrist, it's taken over, basically. That the holistic intuitive may have been more primary, and this sort of verbal conceptual mode, which is really good and very helpful, not sort of anti this mode of mind. It's great at chunking the world into really helpful little bits and just getting a problem here, solving it logically, and outputting a solution. The problem is it's quite blinkered when it chunks things down and loses sight of the bigger picture, potentially, if it isn't also sort of integrated within a broader map. And so what mindfulness training can help us do is facilitate an intentional shift using affect or kind of feelings that upregulate or make the holistic intuitive, broad open, sort of potentially wiser and more sort of holistic view more available to us. And actually it can incorporate some of those better aspects or more helpful aspects of the verbal conceptual mode. So in this world of sort of increasing complexity and now acknowledging how the world's probably always been complex, but some of our problems in this meta crisis is not acknowledging the complexity here and how all these different parts of society interact with each other. And you know, I don't know, you mentioned that the COVID crisis being a crash course in how these things are all interconnected. You've heard people go on the radio and say, you know what, like the social domain, the health domain, the economics domain, and social trust, they're all like connected things rather than being these silos that you have experts in that don't talk to each other. And the holistic intuitive mode may well, you know, support us in having more complex thinking and being able to see that bigger picture. So number 2, hopefully the others are simpler to explain. So
I can confirm that they are. Yeah. The hardest bit to write.
Yeah. So number 2, we have, you know, we're not saying that having a holistic view means that you have like one view and then that is, you're done. For a couple of different reasons we'll go into. We need to have multiple perspectives. We need to, you know, we need to be able to tolerate and embrace and find for ourselves different perspectives. And using the visual metaphor, I mean, perspective is visual, is visual, or the kind of embodied visual metaphor. When something isn't quite clear, we move our head, we move our bodies, we get a different view on it to get a fuller, more three-dimensional perspective on what's going on. If we have a kind of a fixed mindset or a fixed point of view, we're not seeing a fuller picture. And things are too complex now for any one person, let alone one perspective, to have enough of an understanding to be able to act effectively and offer solutions. So we look at how mindfulness training seems to underpin an ability to broaden perspective, take on more perspectives, and particularly a new perspective on our own thoughts, meta-cognition, metacognitive awareness. And develops cognitive flexibility, which is the ability to hold different ideas in mind, to combine them, and to switch between them dexterously. So sort of associated to that is another chapter which is sort of about collective intelligence. So I say that the whole picture is too complex for us, even with our multiple perspectives and our kind of moving around, you know, psychologically. We've got to the point where no one person can have a functioning model of the world and for it to be correct in all circumstances. We need to make use of ways in which we can collaborate together effectively as teams to make sense and to act. And so, you know, we point to experience within high reliability organizations. That these are organizations where it's really bad if something goes wrong. Like a nuclear power plant, an aircraft carrier, or a air traffic control center. And over the last 30 years, they've sort of cottoned on to the fact that the construct of mindfulness is basically exactly what they need at an organizational level. Irrespective of how mindful individuals are, they need mindful organizations. And this supports them as being a collectively intelligent outfit, and by which I mean these mindfulness. A mindful organization has the cognitive infrastructure, and you probably need to read the document. I'm not going to elaborate what that means, but that leads to constant alertness, sensitivity to novelty, sort of cognitive resilience, as I've mentioned, flexibility and rapid learning, all of which we, you know, elsewhere in the document we unpack how mindfulness helps with those things. And so we look at high reliability organizations, and we look at some evidence, particularly from the Boston Consulting Group, showing that what they describe as collective intelligence across many different organizations is boosted by mindfulness training, as assessed by some like practical tasks. And what they think this shows is that mindfulness helps us go from a sort of a me-based perspective on our own work to a we-based primary paradigm for how we're working together. And I don't know about you guys out there, but I'm feeling like this is a lot of information, so I'm trying to sort of slow down a little bit. And the final area we look at in this understanding is the importance of connecting to what's important, particularly through the body. I mentioned earlier the quote from Esther Ouwehand, the Dutch MP, and really showing there how mindfulness is important to her values, tuning into what's important to her and acting accordingly. So we look at those mindfulness programs that explicitly use that kind of values connection, and some of the evidence that shows that mindfulness does indeed help us to do what Esther describes. So once we have attended to what's important and developed our cognitive resilience, so we're not feeling so overwhelmed, and sort of worked in teams to make sense together and developed a more complex understanding, we then move into our third and final domain, which is acting together based on that understanding.
Yeah. So yeah, once I'm going to try not to swear in my final third. Nearly made it. So actually acting, the bit of agency we often think of as agency, when in fact it involves all of this other stuff. So individual action matters in this context, and collective action matters just as much. Everything, anything that we do now to solve any of the biggest problems that we're facing together, we'll probably do together or not at all. However, we've I'm really sorry, I've actually just lost the plot. Do you want to help me talk about automatic behavior?
Yeah, I'd be happy to.
Let's get that cat hair.
I mean, this is maybe not a bad section to have a kind of integrated problem and solution. So again, we break this section into three. The first one is where a lot of people start with mindfulness. It's sort of mindfulness 101. If I had an elevator pitch in order to tell you what it is and how it would be helpful, this might be the first thing you say, and that is that mindfulness is sort of therapeutically helpful and helpful in our own lives, primarily because it helps us to interrupt automatic behavior, which would otherwise be harmful or unskillful. And there's evidence showing that, for instance, mindfulness helps us to interrupt automatic eating behaviors or automatic drinking behaviors, and it sort of reduces problematic impulsivity, and particularly like automatic thinking that is associated with depressive relapse. So that kind of rumination that drags us down into a spiral of despair. Participants in mindfulness-based cognitive therapy courses learn how to step out of that spiral that would otherwise just so habitually drag them down into relapse. Now, the chapter here, speaks a little bit about how this is particularly a problem for us at the moment, but mainly this has kind of always been a problem. That we are creatures of habit, and where we have evolutionary drives or cultural conditioning, which is no longer as skillful as we want it to be, we need help. Basically, we need help to sort of manage our own minds and behavior, and to step out of automaticity. And we sort of, within this chapter, we get back to where we started, or we find the kind of nugget of where we started, which is that mindfulness, or that to live mindfully is to live on purpose more of the time, and that is almost in essence agency. To have intentional action is to live on purpose, and if we're caught up in automatic thinking and not really paying attention to what's going on around us, or caught up in automatic behavior we don't really want anymore because it's no longer serving us, then you are not living an agentic, as much of an agentic life as you might otherwise have.
Yeah, and I think reactivity is really the bread and butter of the traditional mindfulness course, sort of teaching us how much of how often our actions actually aren't governed by our well-formed intentions, but actually are just coming from somewhere beyond even our own lifetimes. And so yeah, restoring ourselves and our intentions as the driver of action is crucial in this context.
And I'll sort of gloss over the next two chapters. We have one which is really sort of homing in on the sort of the clarifying the difference between being mode, doing mode, and driven doing mode, and seeing why being mode actually is the foundation of skillful action, and not the antithesis of activism, for instance, as it's sometimes superficially understood as. And then finally, chapter 3 pulls some of the threads together that we've already seen, like some of the benefits to empathy, listening, cognitive flexibility, perspective taking, sort of values orientation. These things underpin successful collaboration. But then we also look at particularly anger regulation, and how there's evidence that mindfulness is a solid foundation for developing compassion and pro-social qualities, which lead to perhaps more pro-social behavior and interactions. So, in sum, where does this leave us at the end of all of that? Well, we feel that this was a necessary framing and narrative case rather than a kind of robust scientific review, to show that mindfulness can help us reclaim and reorient our attention to what matters, to reflect more wisely and act from collective purpose. And even in the best case scenarios, beyond the climate crisis, or AI running away and exterminating us, and some of the other threats that people are worried about, even in best case scenarios, we're going to have unbelievable change in the next coming decades. The fourth industrial revolution will change almost every aspect of our lives, and we really need to value and invest in, through training and education, that which makes us most human. And as we finish off by saying, perhaps this is going to be an age of humanics rather than age of robotics, because we start to, as we get all the other stuff taken off us, we get to see what is really, truly, specially human, and cultivate that proactively, consciously, and on purpose.
Thank you so much, Jamie and Rosie. That was such a delight. It was it's been a beautiful report to read, and as I say, so thought-provoking. And we've got some lovely comments in the chat box that hopefully you'll get a chance to read, from Nico and Jan, Mark and Tessa. But it was so nice to hear you explain it and bring it to life and pull out different elements of that. And I think there's so much for us to go away and think about. And the way you explained that the Mindfulness Initiative, very much we try to strike the balance between looking at evidence, the scientific, rigorous, evidence-based work, but then trying to push the boundaries on the innovation. And I think this is just it struck that balance beautifully, and I thoroughly enjoyed listening to you both. So thank you so much. Dan, can I just ask if there's anything you would like to add before we get a chance to go to questions?
I mean, I can't top what Rose and Jamie have just summarised, which was a heroic effort. Anyone who's read the report will see there's a lot in there. That was a really nice summary. I guess, I mean, just one reflection that comes to my mind is we kind of explore this idea of thinking about mindfulness as a foundational human capacity, and what that means in very much in the sort of 21st century context that we individually and collectively find ourselves in. And I think for me, what comes through it in the report is that mindfulness is hopefully thought about as foundational in a couple of ways. And one is what Jamie was saying at the beginning, that a lot of certainly discussion of mindfulness in terms of public policy and kind of applications of mindfulness can treat as primary the kind of functional outcomes that scientists have explored into what mindfulness can give us for our mental health or for our empathy with one another, and kind of measurable outcomes, the functional outcomes of mindfulness. And these are really important, and we're not kind of denying the importance of those, but I think the vision of our future and the need for agency in the face of the crises, and as Rosie talked about, the meta-crisis, really does ask questions as to what can we look to help catalyze that agency that we need right now in a much kind of more visionary, bigger picture sense than the kind of sum of the individual functional outcomes or qualities of mindfulness. So I think that's one way in which it's foundational. I think another sense in which mindfulness is foundational or calls to be reflected on as foundational, which comes through, I think, in the report as well, in the paper as well, is coming back to the practice of presence, coming back to what it is to come back to embodied awareness, moment to moment, each of us, whenever, wherever, and that can sometimes get lost in discussions around kind of the why of mindfulness and the why of anything, in terms of looking at finding solutions for our kind of societal problems and so on. And so I think what we say a few times in the report is we're relatively agnostic as to what the particular forms of mindfulness-based intervention can and should and might be going forwards to best deliver the kind of visionary benefits that we're talking about here, whether it's MBSR, MBCT, or more recent innovations. But regardless of those forms and those contexts in which mindfulness up to now has been typically applied, I mean, if we come back to the practice of what it means to be present, to come back to embodied awareness, there's something extremely foundational there, which I think anyone who is a long-standing practitioner will readily appreciate. But we're trying to kind of allude to that aspect of the foundational nature of mindfulness, I think, as well in this report. And hopefully this is something useful for advocates out there of mindfulness to point towards as a comprehensive piece of work, which nonetheless does speak to that very foundational nature. But I'll leave it there. Thank you, Katie.
Thank you, Dan. And just to reiterate Jamie's point on the chat, if people have questions, we do have a Q&A function at the bottom. We do have one question for Greta. I don't know if you can see that, Jamie.
Yeah, we can see that. Yeah.
Do you want to have a go?
And if people want to have a scroll through the questions as well, we've got the function of giving a thumbs up. If you want to hear that question, particularly want to hear that question answered, although I'm sure all the questions are great, but if there are any that you particularly resonate with, then give them a thumbs up, and that just helps us prioritize them. And Pilar, I might we didn't actually introduce Pilar, I have to say. Pilar has been a contributor to the Mindfulness Initiative as well, is sort of helping us with tech support, and may ask you whether you want to be patched in to ask your question, if it needs elucidation.
Fantastic. We do have 5 likes already for the first one. So if you're okay, Rosie and Jamie, to kick off with what's your deepest aspirations for this report?
Well, I mean, I think as the person who has sensed the need for it and led the vision on it, I think this would be a good one for you.
Yeah, sure. I think the primary, we don't shy away from using long words, and we will do another document which is going to be shorter and simpler in terminology, and one that you can more easily share around with people who are non-experts or who aren't already into social change or already into mindfulness stuff. So this report really had sort of 2 target audiences in mind: people who are already quite familiar with mindfulness theory, people who are aware of social change theory, particularly those who think that personal development has a role there, and sort of educating those guys about mindfulness, and then these guys about social change theory and the kind of some of the things we've been picking up with in the cultural context. So the immediate aspiration is to help bring those 2 worlds together. So there is a box in the report particularly about Bildung and metamodernism, which I won't describe now, but they're both really interesting philosophies that have been very influential for us, and a lot of the people that we quote and mention in the text are kind of philosophers or systems theorists or cultural commentators. And I think the mindfulness world would be really served by being more familiar with this bubbling up of an alternative paradigm for social change and politics and economics and all that kind of thing. So then in that world of social change, actually there's often talking about being mode as being important, like we can, and a recognition that actually we need to have a different way of interacting with each other, and some people have mindfulness practices and some have different forms of psychological transformation work, but actually there's pretty poor understanding on the whole of the deeper mechanisms of practice and the theory. So it's like bringing those 2 worlds together is our kind of immediate goal. But if we're looking at the deepest aspirations for this report, I think we completely reimagine education in line with the kind of Bildung philosophy, which is that as Zach Stein says, if education isn't the answer, you're asking the wrong question. And I would go further out than that and say we're thinking about education wrong as something that stops at 18. That actually we're all on a lifelong journey of complexifying, of growing, of becoming more mature, in order to be capable of meeting the great challenges and opportunities that we face. And mindfulness training, as one form of cultivating the heart and mind, should be in the mix. So I would like to see a government department in the UK and in all the countries around the world, which is all about how the ultimate purpose of human endeavor is growth, and flourishing and development. And I'd like to see a kind of mindfulness and psychological development unit in the Cabinet Office that looks at that as being something we want to seriously invest in.
I think I'd like to add something at kind of like at the other end of the scale to that, which is that we will rewrite this piece for different audiences, and it's not certainly not appropriate for all audiences at the moment. But what I would like it to offer ultimately is, again, as soon as you start doing that over there, I can't I mean, there are so many people who understand that 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 we can't carry on the way that we're going in so many directions in our cultural environment and in the world that we share, and want to know what it is that they can do and absolutely don't know where to begin. And I think it's actually been incredibly valuable for me, working through this process, to understand the limits and impediments that there are around agency as things currently are, and the ways in which we can transform our own sensitivity to our environment and our own capacity for understanding and our own capacity for not taking it all on ourselves, but for acting collectively and for nourishing the collective. And I think there's an enormous amount of potential for that, just for that wider audience to begin engaging in that kind of thinking. So
yes.
I'm
yes.
pro.
Exactly, and there's something else here about the why, and that's we have to give credit to the critics of the mindfulness field, both for providing us with an audience for this document. There's a huge appetite to read something like this, partly because people have felt the dissonance and the pain of having something that they care so deeply about criticized as being unhelpful from a kind of collective social change point of view, and has also sort of inspired and sharpened our thinking. So there's a sense, yes, that we want to help the mindfulness field evolve its thinking about itself and think about a bigger frame for the why of mindfulness. Yeah.
Thank you. Dan, did you want to come in on that at all?
I'll just add one aspiration on my side. I mean, completely echo what Jamie and Rosie said. I think the one to add for me is the specific one around what it means to find commonality, what it means to establish and find and inhabit common ground with each other in many different contexts at this point in time. And I guess in particular, I mean, Rosie spoke earlier about the attention economy and forces, very entrenched forces of polarization in the digital space, but of course, which are there in many contexts for us. And there's no easy solutions and no quick wins to collectively move to a more constructive dialogue with each other interpersonally and as different groups. But it's my feeling strongly that connecting with immediate experience, as Jamie said, intentionally but openly, with an allowing but curious and caring quality, again, is certainly not a panacea, but as a foundation for perhaps re-expanding or rebuilding what we understand shared space, shared experience to be. Because I see the fragmentation of our lives socially and kind of intrapersonally with digital media, social media, but many other forces going on at the moment as a very entrenched problem. And I feel that hopefully some of the arguments we put forward here says, as Jamie said, not the panacea, but if we think about education holistically, look to the long term, what are the things we need to put in the mix to help us kind of bridge this inner and outer dimensions of our lives? And it feels like mindfulness should be taken seriously in that context.
Thank you, Dan. I really appreciate that. I think we're going to go over to Siobhan, who has got a great question. And thank you. The questions are coming in now, and Pilar is going through them. But Pilar, are you able to unmute Siobhan so that she could ask her question live?
Yes, 1 second.
That's if she's happy to do so. I don't know whether it's possible to ask Siobhan whether she wants to do that and then sort that out. I've not actually done that before, so good luck. Making that happen.
You were just throwing that over.
I believe it's possible.
I don't know if she's happy with that.
Okay. Well, why don't we leave you to check in with Siobhan and see if she's happy and work out how to do it, and we'll answer one from Pilar has sent us one in the chat.
There is more coming in the chat, but yeah, if we possibly put
Yeah,
them
we
all
could
in the
use the Q&A function, please.
Yeah, that'd be great. And maybe if we're just touching in with Siobhan, can I just hijack my position and ask about COVID, because it came up in one of the questions, and obviously, I guess, do you think it's helped us in terms of, I mean, it has highlighted, as you've rightly said, the systemic challenge and in such an abrupt way, but do you think, how do you think do you think there is a public appetite? Where do you think where do you think it can allow us to move forward, and where do you worry that actually there is there any further blockages? How do you think it's changed the landscape for us making progress?
Just give you the opportunity.
Yeah, no, why don't you?
Well, it was fascinating. So the example that I gave about, understanding that these things aren't separate, to hear. So I mean, I'm not going to name and shame him but someone who's incredibly influential, the chief executive of one of the most, the largest funding organisations in the world. Yeah, sort of saying in a Times article, like almost having a public realization that the social domain and the medical domain and the economic domain were kind of interacting with each other and were somehow connected. And I was just like, if you didn't get that, like, so yeah, it's been interesting to see that happen, and I think it's been tremendously helpful, I think, for everyone to be staring at exponential graphs, because there are other things that are exponential, like climate change, which some of these it's very good to have in the folk psychology or the folk sociology in the world. So yeah, I think it has made us realize a lot of things about our communities, about trust, about the anecdotally what people were reporting, having had to stop, and what that did to their nervous systems, and how that actually helped them to, the volume was turned up on nature, people were saying, and like, this is the loudest spring they've ever heard. Not because the birds were necessarily singing that loudly, but everything else was turned down, as well as their own activity. So I worry, as do a lot of people, how much of those insights will be lost, because you've got to practice insights for them to really be transformative. But we have an opportunity to remind people of them, and I think the kind of mindfulness lens and language, particularly in the face of stress, and there was a real uptick in interest in mindfulness training, anecdotally, through the lockdown, is all positive.
And I think as well,
rambly, but
not at all. One of the accidental benefits in this scenario is just that mindfulness training is so eminently deliverable online, and so much even more needed in the context that people were finding themselves in at home, that actually it's been one of the real sort of silver linings has been the need and the opportunity for people to develop a mindfulness practice. And I kind of anecdotally, and in kind of like, in wider conversations, there's reason to hope that people want to continue with the practice that has changed their lives for the better, not only in the context of them being suddenly made worse. So yeah, there's fingers crossed.
Thank you. I think Siobhan is able to ask her, or is willing to ask a question, as long as her internet holds. So if we're able to unmute her, Pilar, here we go.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Perfect.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for this brilliant document. And for me, the really exciting thing is this notion of collective agency and being able to work as a group. And I wondered whether there had been an opportunity, and it might be that this is an extension piece of work, I don't know, to think about how collective agency from a mindfulness perspective sits alongside what we already understand, particularly sort of from an academic point of view around organizational theory and how groups of people work together. Because if we can sort of join them up, then it helps potentially provide a roadmap or some sort of pathway to see actually how we can encourage more organizations to introduce mindfulness and to find their collective agency.
Thank you, Siobhan. That's great. Dan, do you want to go first?
Sure. I mean, actually, I'm no expert on organizational theory, so I may or may not, perhaps not be best placed to comment. But I guess, I mean, one reflection on that is, I guess something in the organizational sphere that's been kind of gaining a lot of traction for several years is this idea of organizational purpose, and purpose really as distinct from or building beyond and going deeper than simply a list of values or a mission, but really something which connects individuals in an organization to something shared that's big, that people can really sign up to, and connecting kind of inner and outer purpose in that sense. And it feels to me that, and some of the studies we cite in the report certainly point to mindfulness having an important role in terms of our sense of purpose, of course, in terms of being purposeful with how we pay attention moment to moment, and that's not negligible. But also in terms of connecting us to what matters, what we care about, and we, I think Jamie talked about, you know, the hidden wealth of information we can get through checking in with the body moment to moment, and really taking in a wider set of signals from mind and body, and coming back to what do I care about, and maybe what can I give in this situation, what can I do here, and that can be a subtle shift of the question from how we normally engage with a problem or with a challenge in an organizational context, which I think can run pretty deep, and mindfulness in those organizational contexts I think could be a great catalyst. But Jamie or Rosie, do you have anything?
Yeah, so we mentioned in the document about, we get the example of Otto Scharmer's Theory U, because it's a quite well-known one. And so that's an example of what Dan's describing, taking sort of organizational purpose and values from being something you just sort of paint on the wall to something that actually really sort of drives the organizational dynamic through a kind of group mindfulness process, kind of an intervention. You know, one of the issues with being synthesizers and trying to get a kind of a whole picture lens is that we haven't got space to go too deeply in any one of these particular areas, and perhaps there are other people who are better qualified than us to do so. So I would sort of direct you towards the work of Jutta Tobias in the UK, at least, who's been and Anne Speckens and her team over in Holland. And other names sort of escape me right now, but yes, there is a wealth of sort of analogous stuff around organizational theory, and increasingly there's stuff looking at actual interventions, mindfulness interventions, that sit on top of that theory and show that mindfulness has an impact. Yes, definitely future work, but there is stuff out there as well.
Thank you.
seems to be a few questions around writing another version of the report for different audiences, and that obviously came up, and you mentioned, I don't know, Rosie or Jamie, if you've got anything to say on sort of the timeline and of when you might be doing that. You're on mute.
Sorry,
we're on mute.
No.
I can't believe we've managed to get this far without doing that, actually. So far, we've written 3 versions, 1 full version and 2 extremely, by comparison, potted versions, and those have been very much deadline led. And but what they've done is demonstrated that we can that we can produce them in less than 3 years, which is reassuring. So so I mean, I'm quite interested in being led by demand on that count, but obviously there'll be other publications that will go out to shortly as well. And I think we've just about done enough of the formulation for the social philosopher audience and the mindfulness audience. So what comes next is people who don't commonly interact with those worlds. And yeah.
And as ever for a charity like us, I feel like we do an awful lot on very little, and people might assume we have more capacity than we do. So that the main restricting factor here actually is just financial resource, and I've got to move on to other things for a bit. But basically, as soon as we can free up that capacity, I want to get that out. But I would hope by the end of the year.
Sure.
Thank you. And I guess it's all useful to get feedback from all of the audience in terms of where the demand is, as Rosie said, so we can make sure that it's targeted in the right place. I think we had an interesting question from Chris, and we were just seeing if Chris was willing to ask it himself. He is willing. So if we were able to unmute Chris, and then we can hear, here we go. And we've got a picture as well. Over to you, Chris.
Yeah, hi. Great, really helpful, very interesting stuff. I just slightly shudder at some of the implications of this, though, because there I am, minding my own business. I'm a mindfulness consultant, and I do my 8-week course, and I teach people about mindfulness and all of the joys of mindfulness and perceptions, etc. And then all of a sudden, I'm actually told this is actually a bit of an atom bomb, because actually we have got here a weapon that is not just to help these 8 individuals who are in the room with us, but it's a way of complete social transformation. And what I'm just wondering is, how do I, as that individual mindfulness consultant, sort of, as it were, come at this problem? Because there's been a lot of criticism about mindfulness, as you quite rightly say, that it's actually all it's doing is it's just, in a sense, it's supporting the existing system, because it's making the problem an individual problem as opposed to a collective problem. And I completely understand that point. But I think if you turn it around the other way and actually say, no, now it is this really important collective focus to it, my goodness me, that creates quite a challenge for me as a mindfulness consultant, because sort of really what I'm now having to do is say, I need to go into all of these organizations, these big organizations, and say to them, actually, this is about social transformation. We have now, as it were, reconnected the social and the economic. And what we're saying to you is that things have to change hugely from a very, very sort of basic level. And I'm just thinking, wow, am I as a mindfulness coach, do I have the equipment? Do I have the ability to really go into that? And so where does that then take the whole mindfulness community? Does that take us into a quite a different place, which is about me advocating particular things, particular social causes, or particular right ways of doing things? And I'm not therefore sure what I then become.
Yes.
Thank you, Chris. That is a powerful question, and a huge topic, which may end up being our last one. I just, for myself, highlight the quote from Yuval Noah Harari in the document, which is just, as ever, his quotes are knockout. But in terms of, needing to invest in our human consciousness, and saying if we're not careful, we'll end up with downgraded humans misusing upgraded computers to wreak havoc on themselves and on the world. And for my mind, you could insert, wreak havoc on nature or on the climate. But in terms of, I think it's upgrading that human consciousness. But I will hand over to the experts to give a.
Actually, I'm chomping at the bit for this one particularly.
Go ahead, Jamie.
I mean, such a good question, and that's why we're framing this as a discussion paper, not as a report that says this is how everyone needs to teach mindfulness now. And also, we were agnostic about how it's delivered. Whether mindfulness training continues to be predominantly MBSR derived, whether it includes more or less pro-social heart quality cultivation, whether it has ethical components, whether it has sort of social mindfulness systems theory with some kind of look at what you've just described there as sort of framing it in terms of a social change program. The very idea of this report really is to show how even what you might call sort of standard mindfulness training is underpinning vital capacities which are going to be helpful for us as individuals and groups to come together. It's not going to do all the work itself to get that coalescing and that acting going, but it will give us the kind of the cognitive infrastructure, the foundations that will support it if the other conditions are in place. It's really important that that we don't go in. The mindfulness trainers, particularly where there's public money or it's a large organization that isn't bought into a social change vision, that you sort of have to acknowledge the principle of relative liberal neutrality. And we have a footnote in the paper about that, which is to say that we need to resource people to go after the good life or to construct a better society, however they think about that, however they conceive of that, rather than saying this is what a good vision looks like. There are places for some programs that are very explicitly, here's our vision of a good society, here's what social change we need, and here's what mindfulness is going to do in order to get us there. But particularly if we're looking to get policy change, so governments are going to be funding the resource to developing these psychological resources, we have to be really careful that the kind of the underpinning paradigms are acknowledging of the status quo and the mainstream. No such thing as neutral, but like you have to acknowledge where most people are. And that leads me on to the second part of what I wanted to say, which is that you need to start from where people are, and most people, they come to mindfulness because they have some kind of self-regulation issue. For me, it was that attention control. Like I couldn't sit at my desk for long enough. Other people, it's sleep. Some people, it's depression, and and some people it's flourishing and being at their best and having a good life. But often that's tied up with some kind of benefit, and there's a real tension there about like to what extent are we framing this in terms of right, we got to galvanize a collective response to survive as a human race, and how much of it is like I just want to sleep better, to be honest. And then over time, as practice develops over a year or two, then maybe this is the cognitive infrastructure to, you know, support social change. But, you know, I think in the time that we've had now, that hasn't done it justice. But this is a discussion paper. This gives me a good opportunity to say that the Mindfulness Initiative is going to be sponsoring an essay competition to support the really challenging, you know, and helpful alternative viewpoints and issues like you and questions like you raised there, Chris. And also, please do submit reflections and feedback on our website, which you can find on the download page for the document. And also we'll have a follow-up webinar next month with a few sort of experts and innovators offering alternative viewpoints.
That's great. Thank you so much, Jamie. I think we are out of time, which is a shame because we ended up, like ever, at the end of an event with a huge wreath of great questions. But
well, let's capture those questions.
I was just going to say,
add them to the dialogue that we're hoping to facilitate ongoing.
Exactly. So let's cheekily take all of your thoughts and make sure that they are fed into the next iteration, because it was brilliant. But thank you so much to Jamie and to Rosie and to Dan. I know this has really been a labour of love. It's been something that's been in your minds, but actually thinking it through and making it coherent and pulled together and all these elements. You've just done such a fantastic job, so thank you. And thank you to Pilar for fielding all of those questions this evening and working through and supporting behind the scenes. And thank you all for giving up a very sunny evening. I hope you have all managed to be in sunshine at some point today, but we really appreciated it and really appreciated all your feedback and thoughts and insights. Much appreciated. And please read the report, feedback. It's really brilliant, but as Jamie said, it's the start of a discussion and we really want to hear from you. So thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much, Katie, as well.